fathers and sons. Janbolat Mamai was released after 1 month spent in the Aktau detention facility. Commissars in dusty helmets. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommends Kazakhstan to establish an international commission to investigate the Zhanaozen events. Dream Factory. Out of all arts, for us, the cinema is the most important one. Hello, I'm Asylbek Abdulov. You're watching Vlast KZ on kplus. We review all trends, highlights and personalities of the past week. 98 Seyfulina Street, Tausamal Village, Almaty region. That's the address of this week's trouble spot. Explosion in the house left 8 bodies, including 4 of children. Initially, the body count was reported as 7. The investigators also found firearms, ammunition, police uniforms and religious literature at the site. The findings led the Almaty prosecutor's office to initiate a criminal case on conspiring a terrorism attack. The prosecutor's office is now establishing victims' identities and looking for the sources of found firearms, ammunition and police uniforms. The day following the blast, President Nazarbayev held an anti-terrorism meeting where he rather mildly scolded the heads of law enforcement agencies of the country.
We must admit that our state and society in general is under high pressure by radical extremist elements. People are outraged by the inability of law enforcement officials to prevent all these crimes. Lack of professionalism leads to casualties among police officers. Due to poor work, we are unable to timely suppress these crimes. As a president and the guarantor of the Constitution, I am dissatisfied with the work of law enforcement officials, particularly by the National Security Committee. The efforts that we undertake are not effective enough.
The head of the state counted dozens of victims and over 100 crimes linked to terrorism and extremism over the past 2 years. He also gave his explanation of the situation.
The terrorism issue is quite widespread around the world. We live in peace in our own country, and this made us all relaxed.
Judging by operations reports and leaks from the president's administration, the state security forces are busy exclusively with anti-dissidence efforts as well as traditional inter-agency war. Following President's criticism of the National Security Committee, it appears the Interior Ministry and its supervisor, the head of the President's administration, Aslan Musin, is clearly in favor of the head of state. In the meantime, the NSC chairman, Nurtay Bakayev, Aslan Musin's main rival for the position of the main power broker and the ability to influence Nursultan Nazarbayev's decisions, received a severe blow in a form of public criticism right in front of the whole country and international community. By now, though, the long-time associate of the president is already used to extreme ups and downs, and even some sacrifices in the name of his boss. The NSC faces Nazarbayev's criticism at a time of a seeming thaw in relation to the people involved in the Zhanaozen case. The mediation of famous artists and respected public figures loosened the NSC's grip. The release of well-known stage director Bulat Atabayev through the efforts of intermediary filmmaker Yermek Tursunov was interpreted by observers as an act of humanity, something historically alien to the security agency. No one rushed to call this a new trend, but on Thursday, the 24-year-old Janbolat Mamai, charged with inciting social hatred and conspiring to overthrow the government, was also released from jail. It appears this time the matters were helped by Tuligen Zhukeyev, the former secretary of the Security Council. Similar to Atabayev, Mamai was released on exemption from criminal liability due to repentance.
Toothless. Who would have thought this baby would be in politics? She counts every day since his arrest. This is day 25. Minizatapak goes through her only son's photographs all day long. This is Janbolat in kindergarten. Here he is at school. Here are his student years. This is Janbolat's room. Minizatapai spends a lot of time in his room. She sifts through his favorite toys. She was always against his political activities, but in time she had to accept his choice. He chose this path, and now I only wish for him to go through it with dignity. I pray to God for truth to prevail. I think he will be acquitted. I can feel it in my heart. We recorded this interview on Wednesday. The next day, the young politician was released. Jambolat arrived in Almaty late Thursday night. His father, Mamai Bekrojiv, and politician Toligen Zhukev were at his side. This time, the role of political prisoners liberator was opposition politician Toligen Zhukev. At a press conference organized on Friday, Zhukev said he did not follow Tursunov's footsteps. He used his own connections in the release of Mamai. I spoke with highly influential people who make decisions and persuaded them. It was an uneasy discussion. I told them it makes no sense to confine them, that their guilt does not fit the 7 to 12-year sentence. Like Bolat Atabayev, Jean-Bolat Mamai was accused of inciting social hatred and a violent overthrow of the constitutional regime. And like Atabayev, Mamai was reclassified as a witness after his active repentance. We did not give statements against anyone. Our conscience is clear. We are ready to stand by our words. I confess that I went to Zhanaozian and spoke there. I regret that there were human casualties. Last week, stage director Bolat Atabayev, who was released with the help of his colleague Yermek Tursunov, gave a press conference in this very press center. Tursunov's story inspired everyone to embark on rescue missions. Azamat Yazbirgan's action did not come to fruition, although his only intention was to congratulate President Nazarbayev. I brought flowers to the president's monument on his birthday since I cannot reach him directly. I did not want to bring him a gift. I wanted to ask him for one instead, to free young politician and journalist Jean-Bolat Mamai. But as it turns out, you can't even express your wishes here. We decided to take matters into our own hands and act. We appealed to Abakayev to allow us visitation rights at the Aktau detention center so that we could follow Tursunov's lead and free our friends and colleagues. This is how the opposition's veterans stood up for their friends and colleagues this week. They wrote a letter to NSC chairman Abakayev with a request to grant them the same rights as Yermek Tursunov. The politicians announced they are ready to hold talks with friends sitting in an Aktau jail. I agreed to convince Kozlov and Sapargali not to run for president. At the moment, Vladimir Kozlov, Akshanat Aminov, and Serik Sapargali are detained on charges of inciting social hatred. Sapargali is in a difficult situation. He has diabetes. I want to make an addition to the appeal we sent to Abakayev and ask them to release Sapargali considering his health condition. Serik Sapargali's public work began in the late 80s of the last century. He headed the western branch of the Azat movement and was actively involved in the renaming process of streets and cities. He created labor unions and alliances for the unemployed. Last year, he ran for president. Tolubek Karamindin does not believe that his friend Serik Sapargali is a criminal. His only crime is that he could not stand idly by and watch as the oil workers suffer. Nobody visits Sapargali in the Aktau detention center. His brother and sisters passed away. He is divorced. His only son is in the army. Serik Sapargali has nothing to do with the Zhanaozian tragedy. Just like Atabayev and others, he went there to support the oil workers. He was there only twice. He wanted everything to be solved lawfully. He told the authorities, these are your own people. They have no political demands, only social. And now the crime that he did not commit is pinned on Serik. According to Tolubek, Serik Sapargali visited Aktau twice, but at the time the politician was unable to even meet the striking oil workers. The Prosecutor General's office issued us this slip. It warns us that we must not organize pickets and demonstrations. If we come out to visit the striking oil workers in the square, we will be automatically arrested. Another prisoner in the Zhanaozian case is trade union activist Akshanat Aminov. He was first detained on June 30th, 2011 and convicted to 1 year of probation. The article remains the same, inciting social hatred. You realize every day that you need to go to the detention ward, pass on things to Sapargali and Vladimir, speak to the lawyer. Vladimir Kozlov's wife Aliya now splits her time between Almaty and Aktau. In 6 months, she met her husband 4 times. After Tursunov's action, Aliya also wrote Nurtai Abakayev and is still awaiting his response. I was hoping for a fair trial where we could prove our innocence. When I read and watch these news, Zhakishev was sentenced to 14 years. Recently he was sentenced for the second time and was given another 10. When I look at all this, I get the feeling that the same fate might be awaiting us. During the interview, Aliya Toruzbekova said that the preparations for Akjan Atamina's release are allegedly being made. Later, the information was confirmed by the release Shambhala Pamai. If Vladimir Kozlov's and Serhiy Sapargali's own Tursunov and Zhukev does not turn up, the scorching hot summer of 2012 will end in a trial of the two politicians.
Next on Vlast KZ. Commissars in dusty helmets. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommends Kazakhstan to establish an international commission to investigate the Zhanaozen events. Dream Factory. Out of all arts, for us, the cinema is the most important one. We will return in a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Главные события в Казахстане. Достоверные факты. Эксклюзивные комментарии. Читайте в Казахстане информационно-аналитический портал «Республика». Чтобы обойти блокировки, воспользуйтесь доменом respublicas.info. Вы окажетесь на так называемом прокси-портале. Специально разработанные канадскими специалистами по интернет-технологиям, прокси-порталы помогают пользователям получать информацию в тех странах, где блокируют интернет-ресурсы. В Китае, Иране, в Казахстане. Вы принимаете условия использования системы и попадаете на страницу информационно-аналитического портала «Республика». Материалы интернет-портала также доступны пользователям всемирной сети Facebook. facebook.com/respublica.kaz. Если вы хотите поделиться информацией, вам есть что рассказать, звоните в редакцию «Республики». Наши телефоны в Казахстане +7 727 273 92 95, в Москве +7 495 621 87 03.
Новости Казахстана на казахском языке смотрите в 21:00 и далее каждый нечетный час. Новости Казахстана на русском языке в 22:00 и далее каждый четный час. Новости Казахстана на английском языке смотрите в 16:30, 17:30, 18:30 и 19:30 со вторника по субботу. Время Астаны. Изготовление и размещение рекламы на канале KplusTV.
The humanization of Kazakhstan's justice system continued past week with the release of Bolat Amanyazov and Bolat Zilov, the defendants in the Shetpe violence case. Both were charged with organizing mass disorders, resistance to arrest and obstruction of traffic in the Shetpe railway station in December last year. 2 charges were dropped altogether and the men were pardoned in relation to the third. Now, everyone is waiting the main trial linked to Zhanaozen. It is assumed that the process involving Kozlov, Sapargali and Aminov will take place in early August. The prisoner's dock could be less occupied if some of the accused will be reassigned as witnesses, once again due to the mediation of civil society. It is obvious that the main blow will be directed against Alga party leader Vladimir Kozlov. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillay, who visited Kazakhstan this past week, said at the end of her tour that the case of Vladimir Kozlov drew her attention and she will continue closely monitoring the developments. The commissioner urged Kazakhstan's Prime Minister to convey this message to Nursultan Nazarbayev. Pillay also looked into reports of tortures in country's prisons. Coincidentally, the issue was vividly illustrated with the inmates' protest in October detention center. On July 11th, dozens of prisoners' relatives gathered in front of the detention facility in Aktobe. They told reporters that the inmates are subjected to physical abuse. 13 people sliced their stomachs open in protest against the detention regime. For several hours, none of the prison staff bothered to explain to relatives what was exactly happening. The inmates were screaming for help and knocking on the walls with metal mugs. A few relatives and reporters managed to climb up the roof of a nearly 5-story building where they could see blood-stained bed sheets with the words "Help" and "They're killing us" hanging from the prison windows. Among those gathered outside the prison, there were women in headscarves. Some had husbands, others had brothers in prison. However, they referred to all of the prisoners as their brothers and called to accept Islam. Accept Islam and we will fight together against these filthy creatures. The prison representatives finally came outside to negotiate with the inmates' families. They reported that the prisoners demanded to ease the prison regime, to allow the use of mobile phones, to switch off the cell phone jammers, and to have freedom of movement inside the facility. Once the administration refused to meet these requirements, the prisoners went on hunger strike and sliced their stomachs open. The inmates' relatives state the opposite. Galina Petukhova received a phone call from her son Alexander from the prison. There were only 3 instigators and the rest have nothing to do with all this. They could only disagree with incarceration condition. We've talked to the senior medical officer and he told us that cuts were only superficial and gave us no further explanation. They said they will take care of this. No, they only told me that he had barricaded himself in the prison cell.
Let's shake your hand for the just. Thank you.
While Aktobe security forces rushed to gather an emergency briefing and to clarify that prison conditions in Aktobe detention facility meet the standards, the government officials were hosting the distinguished guests. Navi Pillai, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, started her 2-day visit from meetings with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kazakhanov, in Almaty. The press was only allowed to record the protocol. The High Commissioner later met with NGOs representatives in Almaty without the press and then flew to Astana, where she was met by the leadership of all agencies responsible for human rights. Navi Pillai also pointed out to the head of the Constitutional Council, Rogov, that his agency shall not revise the presidential decrees. At the concluding press conference, the UN High Commissioner reviewed Zhanaozen events in more detail. In her report, she directly and strongly pointed out all the violations committed by authorities which led to riots and then to execution of civilians.
In other words, whether it was both necessary and proportional. It is also not clear how many of the problems acknowledged by the government are systemic rather than unique to KZ. I believe it is extremely damaging to Kazakhstan's reputation to have so much uncertainty hanging over such a serious episode, resulting in substantial loss of life.
30 defendants out of 37 in Zhanaozen case stated that their testimonies were extorted by tortures during the trial. The reporters and human rights activists were banned from recording it on video. Nevertheless, the horrifying reports of oil workers on the abuse by security officials, on how they were beaten, forced to strip naked and lie on a concrete floor, threatened with violence and physical reprisals against their families and friends, have quickly scattered across the country. The story of the defendant Alexander Bazhenko, who was given a status of a witness, is one of the only video evidences of torture. On the 18th, the Oman riot police captured me right outside my house. Then they put me in the police vehicle and started beating me. Then they brought me into the garage. They kept me there from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. They had me sitting in the water with my socks on. I was subjected to physical abuse and they broke my wrist. There were about 150 people. Most of them had shoes on and about 50 of us were waiting there without our footwear. Then they took us to the municipal department of the interior where they beat us in the kidney area. Did they beat others as well? Of course, all of us were beaten. We are the criminals who destroyed our own town. The High Commissioner has recommended the government of Kazakhstan to form an international commission to investigate the Zhanaozen incident. She said that this tragedy was a result of corruption at the local level, and these types of investigation methods are unacceptable in a democratic society.
Allegations of torture and false confessions do not seem to have been properly investigated, and there are many serious question marks over the fairness of judicial processes and the conduct of trials.
Kazakhstan had joined the UN Convention Against Torture in 1998. Since 2002, the torture is considered a criminal offense. However, according to the coalition of NGOs in Kazakhstan, the number of complaints from citizens over the past 5 years has tripled. In 2011, there were 411 complaints, and most of them were against police officers. Yet only 13 criminal cases on charges of torture were initiated last year. According to human rights activists, the accused of torture are usually charged with less severe article, the abuse of official position. The prison leadership threatened to throw us into an isolation ward. I was beaten by Akhmetov, Urkimbayev and Kurmanov. Then they forced me to sign the document and did so. We were, we are, and we will be subjected to physical abuse, even more so now that we've made this video, or perhaps you would later find out that we've committed a suicide. Although I really wouldn't want that to happen, I want to stay alive. The arrival of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Kazakhstan was initiated by local authorities. Kazakhstan applied for membership in the UN Human Rights Council for 2013, and it needs to recover its tainted reputation, says the human rights activist Evgeny Zhovtis. Despite the very high rank of the guest, whose grade is equal to Deputy Secretary General of the UN, the Ombudsman was very skeptical about the harsh speech. On one hand, Kazakhstan is a member of international treaties of a legal nature. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has a legal force and is mandatory. The Convention on Torture is also mandatory. However, the UN High Commissioner by herself is a figure who can only give advices and nothing more. Her reports are advisory in nature. On the other hand, if the country is a member of the UN, it is inappropriate from moral and political point of view, since you've already signed the document. An important part of the Commissioner's speech was the initiation of an international commission to investigate the Zhanaozen incident. However, the director of the Kazakhstan Bureau for Human Rights barely believes this will actually take place. These UN initiatives in Central Asian countries have been already proposed following the events in Andijan and Osh, but to no avail. It is hopeless to believe that Kazakhstan will become a positive example and will meet the requirements of international organizations. All overtures of top officials to the UN High Commissioner ended with rough reprimands. On Friday, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs released an official statement disagreeing with the analysis of Zhanaozen events made by Pillai, emphasizing that the right to life and security of the population have always been fundamental values and that an objective assessment of the events was already made by international experts and human rights activists who attended the open court trials. In our opinion, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pillai, gave one-sided assessment of the situation in Zhanaozen, despite the extensive information provided during meetings with officials in Kazakhstan. The new presidential advisor is probably another way for Kazakhstan to mock the High Commissioner. Former mayor of Mangistau, Krymbek Kushurbayev, who was dismissed from his position upon Zhanaozen events, has successfully escaped the prosecution, unlike his subordinates, the ex-governors of Zhanaozen, Sarbapeyev and Babakhanov. Moreover, he was appointed presidential advisor by the head of the state himself, apparently for his commitment to fundamental values. Last week, the president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, took upon himself to define the main direction for Kazakhstan's cultural elite. In his article, Social Modernization of Kazakhstan, 20 Steps to Universal Labor Society, the head of state said that the culture must finally turn its attention to modern working men. Nazarbayev complains about the lack of domestic culture products like movies, books, plays and TV shows dedicated to blue collars and professionals in their fields. The intellectual elite's response to the president's initiative will likely be active and passionate, since it was tipped about the location of the new gold mine. Unfortunately, when art meets state procurement system, the art usually ends and big-time corruption begins.
This is how the final episode of the online television series OnLive.KZ was recorded on a regular digital SLR camera. The film crew is made up of 7 people, which are the actors, directors, and producers at the same time. The story about 3 friends became very popular on Kaznet. The short fragment from a series, Mama Luba in Kazakh, gathered almost 500,000 views on YouTube. The filmmakers are confident that the key to their success are conversations on relevant topics, instead of theatrical dialogues and ultra-philosophic ideas. According to the young filmmakers, there isn't much of this kind of films in Kazakhstan. There are neither good specialists nor interesting screenplays. Each film director has to make the art house film just to show how he sees the art and the motion picture industry, to present the film in festivals as opposed to the mainstream audience. Basically, it's the film for the sake of the film, really. In Kazakhstan's release, the share of Hollywood movies is 70%, Russia's 25%, whereas the share of domestic films is rather negligible. Part of Kazakh movies doesn't get released at all, and whatever makes it to the big screens usually does not pay off. Box office takings from the main premieres of Rekmeng Bala are already called unprecedented in the history of Kazakh cinema. For the first time, the domestic motion picture has broken all records, $2 million since the film's release, yet it's still 6 times less than what was spent. The main Kazakh blockbuster's budget is estimated at $12 million. If we produced high-quality films, it would be easy to export them, which will make our motion picture industry world famous, and we will be able to sell our films abroad. The directors of OnLive.KZ TV series say that it doesn't cost them much to produce it. In the future, they plan to start rather a full-blown project, as they already found a producer. I believe it's possible to make a good movie for approximately $50,000 to $100,000, which will be watchable and with quality not worse than those shown in the cinema. However, editor of Kino24.KZ, Karim Kadarbayev, is rather skeptical on this matter. His estimates for a film budget are much higher, otherwise it may fail at the box office. These days, it's possible to shoot a movie ideally for $300,000 to $500,000 to make it pay off. A vivid example is the movie called Cocktail for a Star. The head of his own film studio, which has won numerous festival prizes, received this award for the film called Paradise for the Mom. The budget of this film is about $1 million. It was produced without government's money. Eventually, the film failed at the box office. This practice prevails in the whole filmmaking industry of Kazakhstan, said the former head of Kazakhfilm. Sergei Azimov explained that this was due to no release on a national level and any sort of preferences. This situation is perfectly fine with those important individuals who are making benefits from this, because I believe that the government's patronage is not free, as the cinema was making large profits for the government at all times. Meanwhile, the officials avoid conversations about the government policy on national cinematography. Even upon sending written requests, we fail to receive comments from Kazakhfilm and the Ministry of Culture on how much budget money is allocated for the most important of the arts. How much money a year is allocated to Kazakhfilm for filmmaking? Please address this question in written form. Inspired by the high ratings on the internet, the authors of OnLive.KZ decided to run it on television. In our opinion, OnLive.KZ series should have been launched on TV, but unfortunately the channels rejected our offer for no obvious reason. In response to the letter addressed to the Minister of Culture and Information, they have received a formal reply. I received a rude response saying that according to the laws I should participate in competitions. The funding for my project is not provided in their budget. However, not only beginners receive such responses. The reputable film director Sergei Azimov often receives denies as well. This movie does not correspond to the strategic concepts of the life they wanted to see. At the grandiose annual Festival of Action Films, which is generously funded by the government, the celebrity Timur Bekmambetov announced about his grand plans. We no longer organize parades of the 90s celebrities. Instead, we decided to spend every effort to make Astana the center of Asian cinematography. Bekmambetov knows better. His projects are loved and financially supported in Kazakhstan, and so is Yegor Konchalovsky. This type of films apparently is more likely to resemble the notion of the ideal film in Kazakhstan, according to officials from the Ministry of Culture. They say movies should be patriotic. Then we will have something like Nuratan videos portraying everyone as communists, which is not the same in reality. Why do most filmmakers of Kazakhstan think that our audience is stupid? It's not stupid at all. The film critic Karim Kadarbayev lists the movies that received solid allocated funds from the budget. For instance, one of the films vividly called For the Sake of the Future. This movie, which is dedicated to the Bolashak program, is sterile, according to Kadarbayev. He believes that patriotism should be developed in a different manner. Patriotism shouldn't be encouraged through slogans in some movies, but through the stories. The Jean-Jacques Mimbala was very successful at it. This was a story about love and friendship. On Live.KZ is also a story about love and friendship. Young people shoot the series in between their primary jobs, spending their own money. The film director works at Kosmos. The main character of the film, Big Balak, is a computer science teacher. Over the weekend, the filmmakers work to make side money at the weddings. They can't rely on receiving government funding just yet.
You were watching Vlast KZ on KPLUS channel. Trends, highlights and personalities of the past week. Goodbye.